On the humid morning of July 11th, 1804, a single shot rang out across the rocky cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey, shattering the silence of the Hudson River. In that fraction of a second, Alexander Hamilton fell to the ground, mortally wounded. Standing opposite him, pistol still smoking in his hand, was Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States. In that frozen moment, Burr believed he had vindicated his honor, cleansing his name of the insults Hamilton had hurled at him for decades. But as the smoke cleared and the boatmen rushed to carry the fallen founding father away, a terrible reality began to settle over the scene. Aaron Burr had indeed won the duel, but he had lost his life. He had walked onto that ledge a statesman. He walked off it a pariah, a marked man, a Cain wandering in the wilderness of a nation that suddenly despised him. Most men faced with such absolute ruin would have crumbled. They would have retreated into the shadows of obscurity, content to live out their days in repentance and silence. But Aaron Burr was not most men. He was a creature of immense, terrifying resilience and a hunger for relevance that bordered on madness. As the doors of Washington slammed shut in his face and the salons of New York barred their gates, Burr did not look down in shame. Instead, he looked west. He looked past the Appalachian Mountains to the wild, lawless territories of the frontier, and he saw what no one else dared to see, a blank canvas. If the United States would not have him as its president, he decided he would simply break the United States in half and build a new empire from the pieces. This is the story of the void that opened up in a man's soul when his ambition outlived his career, and how he tried to fill that emptiness by stealing half a continent. When Aaron Burr returned to his grand estate at Richmond Hill after the duel, knowing full well he had just killed the most famous economist in America, he did something chilling. He sat down to breakfast. He ate his eggs with a steady hand. He read his book. This supernatural ability to compartmentalize, to lock the horror in a box and throw away the key, is the defining trait of his character. It reveals a mind that viewed the world not through the lens of morality, but through the lens of utility. To him, Hamilton was an obstacle that had been removed. The duel was a transaction that had been settled. However, the world outside the windows of Richmond Hill was not so cold or calculated. It was burning with rage. The death of Hamilton unleashed a tidal wave of grief and fury that swept through the young republic. New York and New Jersey, competing to see who could condemn him faster, both issued warrants for his arrest. The sitting Vice President of the United States was technically a fugitive from justice, forced to flee south by cover of night, hiding in the homes of loyal friends, moving like a shadow through the very country he was sworn to serve. Consider the sheer Shakespearean tragedy of this fall from grace. Only 4 years earlier, in the election of 1800, Aaron Burr had tied with Thomas Jefferson for the presidency. He had been one single vote away from being the most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere. Now, he was a political corpse. He returned to Washington, D.C. to finish his term as vice president, presiding over the Senate with a gavel in his hand while senators whispered behind their hands and looked at him with a mixture of awe and revulsion. He was a dead man walking through the halls of power, fully aware that when his term expired in March 1805, he would be cast out into a void. He was drowning in debt, his political party had abandoned him, and his enemies were circling. It is in this terrifying existential vacuum that his fatal weakness, his hamartia, took total control. Burr's ambition was not a coat he could take off. It was his skin. He could not exist without being a player in the great game. He needed to be relevant. He needed to be powerful. And he needed to be feared. If the rigid, moralistic society of the East Coast rejected him, Then he reasoned that the East Coast was the problem. He turned his gaze to the map on his wall. Beyond the mountains lay the Louisiana Territory and the Spanish lands of Mexico. Vast, chaotic, fluid worlds where a man's past mattered less than his pistol and his wits. Burr saw a crack in the foundation of the American Republic, a fault line running between the settled East and the Wild West, and he decided to stick a crowbar into it to see if he could pry the continent apart. We must strip away the modern, solidified image of the United States to understand Burr's logic. In 1804, the map of North America was not a fixed puzzle. It was a liquid spill. The Louisiana Purchase had just doubled the size of the nation, but the government in Washington had barely any control over these new lands. The people living in Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and New Orleans felt no deep loyalty to the elites in Virginia or Massachusetts. They felt ignored, vulnerable, and angry. They were surrounded by the Spanish Empire, which still held Mexico, Florida, and Texas. Burr, with his brilliant legal mind, analyzed this instability and saw a trinity of dark opportunities. He realized he could potentially convince the disgruntled Western states to secede from the Union, forming a new, vigorous republic centered on the Mississippi River. Alternatively, he could raise a private army of adventurers to invade Spanish Mexico, claiming the rich silver mines and establishing a new kingdom. Or, in his most grandiose vision, he could combine these two plans, take the American West, conquer Mexico, and fuse them into a massive empire of the West, stretching from the Ohio River to the Isthmus of Panama. This was not merely a fantasy. It was a viable geopolitical strategy in an era when borders were drawn in sand. But to achieve such a monumental theft of territory, Burr needed resources that a bankrupt vice president did not possess. He needed fleets, he needed cannons, and he needed gold. And since he could not get them from the American Congress, he decided with cold pragmatism to get them from America's enemies. The narrative turns into a high-stakes spy thriller in August of 1804. Just weeks after killing Hamilton while still serving as the second highest official in the U.S. government, Burr arranged a clandestine meeting with Anthony Merry, the British minister to the United States. Merry was a stiff, pompous diplomat who harbored a deep personal hatred for Thomas Jefferson, whom he felt had insulted him by ignoring diplomatic protocol. Burr played on Merry's vanity and his hatred like a virtuoso playing a violin. In the shadows of a private residence, Burr offered a proposal that, had it been discovered at the time, would have led to his immediate execution for high treason. He looked the British representative in the eye and lied with magnificent confidence. He told Merry that the American Union was already crumbling, that the people of the West were ready to break away, and that he, Aaron Burr, was the man to lead them. He asked for $500,000 and a British naval blockade at the mouth of the Mississippi River to support his uprising. In exchange, he promised Britain a friendly new neighbor that would provide trade benefits and check the expansion of the dangerous, chaotic American democracy. The magnitude of this betrayal is breathtaking. The vice president was asking the British Empire, the enemy the U.S. had fought a revolution against only 20 years prior, to help him dismantle the United States from the inside. Anthony Merry was ecstatic. He wrote back to London in secret ciphers, urging the Foreign Office to support Mr. Burr's plan, convinced that the dissolution of the American Republic was at hand. But Burr, ever the operator, did not stop there. He simultaneously opened secret channels with the Spanish minister, the Marquisate of Casa Irujo. To the Spanish, he told a completely different story. He carefully omitted his plans to invade Mexico, knowing that would make them enemies. Instead, he told them he planned only to break up the United States, which would remove the American threat to Spanish colonies. He was running a geopolitical Ponzi scheme, promising the British he would attack Spain and promising the Spanish he would attack America, all while his only true allegiance was to the empire of Aaron Burr. Before he could fully launch this conspiracy, Burr had to perform his final official act. On March 2, 1805, the Senate chamber became the stage for one of the most dramatic scenes in American political history. Burr stood up to give his farewell address. The room was filled with men who hated him, men who feared him, and men who believed him to be a murderer. He stood there, a small man with piercing black eyes, dressed in impeccable black silk, looking like a fallen angel. When he spoke, he did not speak with bitterness or rage. He spoke with a profound melancholic eloquence about the Senate as the sanctuary of law and the last hope of the Constitution. He spoke with such dignity and such palpable sadness that the mood in the room shifted. Hardened politicians, men who had spent years trying to destroy him, began to weep openly. Senator Samuel Mitchell later wrote that Burr had spoken with such force that tears flowed from eyes not used to weeping. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Burr was painting a portrait of himself for history, crafting the image of the misunderstood patriot, the victim of partisan cruelty. As he walked out of the Capitol building for the last time, he wasn't just walking into retirement. He was walking out of the legal world and into the wilderness. He left the Senate a statesman, but the moment he stepped onto the dusty road, he became a conspirator. The vision Burr carried in his mind was not abstract. It was specific and territorial. He purchased a claim to a massive tract of land in the Louisiana Territory known as the Bastrop Tract, over 300,000 acres on the Wachita River. Ostensibly, this purchase was for farming and colonization, a legitimate business venture to settle the frontier. In reality, it was the staging ground for a revolution. It was to be the rallying point where he would gather young, adventurous men who, like him, felt stifled by the rigid society of the East. He envisioned a flotilla of flatboats traveling down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, gathering strength like a rolling snowball. His plan had a flexible, predatory logic. If the U.S. government was weak and disorganized, he would seize New Orleans and separate the West. If the U.S. government rallied to stop him, he would pivot, bypass New Orleans, and sail straight for Veracruz to march on Mexico City. He saw himself sitting on the throne of the Montezumas, establishing a liberal, enlightened monarchy in the heart of the Americas. And the most poignant part of this grand delusion was his intended heir. He had no surviving sons to inherit this stolen kingdom. The person he wanted to place on the steps of the throne next to him was his beloved daughter, Theodosia. We cannot fully grasp the depth of Burr's treason without understanding the depth of his love. Aaron Burr was a man who viewed women as intellectual equals long before it was fashionable. He had educated Theodosia as if she were a prince, teaching her Latin, Greek, French, philosophy, and mathematics. She was his intellectual mirror, his soulmate, and the only human being he truly trusted. After his wife died, Theodosia became the center of his universe. In his mind, this empire wasn't just a vehicle for his own vanity, it was an inheritance for her. He wanted to make her an empress, to give her a stage worthy of her brilliance. He wrote to her constantly during this period, his letters filled with ciphers, hints, and grand promises that the gods had something great in store for them. This adds a layer of profound tragedy to the conspiracy. Burr was not just a power-hungry villain. He was a father trying to build a castle for his princess, but he was building it on the quicksand of treason. Theodosia, who was married to Joseph Alston, a wealthy planter in South Carolina, was sickly and frail, yet she possessed a fierce, unwavering loyalty to her father. She became a willing co-conspirator, hosting meetings, carrying messages, and dreaming his dreams. Burr had entangled the one thing he loved into the deadly web of his crime. By trying to exalt her, he was placing her directly in the line of fire, setting the stage for the terrible tragedy that would eventually consume them both. Historians often compare Burr to Catiline, the charismatic Roman senator who conspired to overthrow the Roman Republic when his political ambitions were thwarted. Like Catiline, Burr was an aristocrat who fell into debt and disgrace. Like Catiline, Burr appealed to the disaffected, the adventurers, and the debtors who felt left behind by the system. He represented the dark shadow side of the American dream. If Thomas Jefferson envisioned an America of yeoman farmers, static, agrarian, and virtuous, Burr envisioned an America of ambition, expansion, military glory, and fluid morality. The American dream promises that you can be anything you want. Burr simply asked the forbidden question, "Can I be a king?" The American dream says, "Go west." Burr asked, "How far west?" "Can I take Mexico too?" He pushed the logic of American individualism to its absolute breaking point, rejecting the social contract in favor of the will to power. In his own mind, he was never a traitor. He viewed himself as a liberator. He believed he was freeing the Western settlers from the tyranny of Jefferson's slow, boring, Virginia-dominated government. He believed he was liberating the Mexicans from the decadent Spanish rule. He justified his treason with the philosophy that the map was not finished, and that strong men had the right to draw the lines wherever they could hold them. Aaron Burr was a brilliant lawyer. He understood the definition of treason better than anyone. Therefore, he almost never wrote down the specific details of his plot. When writing to Anthony Merry, he used complex codes. When speaking with his accomplices, he employed metaphors and vague promises. He maintained a cover that was reasonably refuted. To the British, he was a separatist. To the Spanish, he was a protector. To the settlers, he was a land developer. To Theodosia, he was an emperor. Which one was the real Burr? Perhaps none of them, or perhaps all of them. He was a chameleon, changing his colors to match the desires of whoever he was seducing. But chameleons make one fatal mistake. They assume the environment won't change. Burr did not realize that the environment was shifting rapidly beneath his feet. Thomas Jefferson was watching from the White House with growing suspicion. Spies were tracking his movements. And the man he trusted most, General James Wilkinson, a man even more corrupt than Burr himself, was preparing to become the Brutus to his Caesar. The stage was set, the players were in motion, and the tragedy of the American Napoleon was about to begin. In the middle of the Ohio River, near the present-day town of Parkersburg, West Virginia, there once lay a physical manifestation of a fairy tale. It was an island, shrouded in mist and willow trees, that held a secret. In the rugged, mud-stained wilderness of the American frontier in 1805, where most men lived in log cabins and fought off bears, this island contained a Palladian mansion of shocking opulence. It had alabaster lamps, Persian carpets, a library filled with leather-bound books, and a chemistry laboratory. It was a European paradise transplanted into the American wild, a Garden of Eden, built by a wealthy, eccentric Irish aristocrat named Harmon Blennerhassett. But, as every theology student knows, the Garden of Eden would be nothing without the destructive serpent. In the spring of 1805, the serpent appeared on a humble, flat-bottomed boat. It was small, charming, and possessed eyes that seemed capable of hypnotizing anyone who looked into them. Aaron Burr stepped ashore on Blennerhassett Island, not as a friend, but as a predator. He saw the island not for its beauty, but for its strategic location and the immense wealth of its naive owner. The tragedy of the Blennerhassett family is a study of how one man's poisonous ambition can infect and destroy an entire paradise. It is the story of how Aaron Burr transformed a sanctuary of art and science into a military base for a treacherous empire. To track the progress of this conspiracy, we must follow the geography of the river. After leaving Washington and the wreckage of his political career, Aaron Burr traveled west to Pittsburgh. He embarked on the Ohio River, a waterway that served as the grand artery of the American frontier. In 1805, the Ohio River was more than just a body of water. It was the psychological border between civilization and chaos. To the east lay the laws, the debts, and the judgments of the United States. To the west lay the unknown, a fluid world where a man could reinvent himself or disappear entirely. Burr moved down the river with the aura of a fallen king. He stopped in towns like Marietta and Cincinnati, greeted not as a murderer, but as a celebrity. The people of the West did not care about Alexander Hamilton. To them, Hamilton was a symbol of the eastern banks that foreclosed on their farms. Burr, the man who killed him, was viewed with a fascinated respect. He was treated to dinners, balls, and toasts. But Burr was not interested in the adoration of the common crowds. He was hunting for a specific type of partner, someone with money, someone with dissatisfaction, and someone gullible enough to believe in a mirage. As his boat drifted closer to the island near Belpre, Ohio, Burr knew exactly who he was looking for. He had done his research. He knew that Harmon Blennerhassett was a man estranged from his homeland, ostracized for a scandalous marriage, and desperate for validation. Burr didn't just stumble upon the island, he targeted it with the precision of a missile locking onto a heat signature. We must pause to reconstruct the victim of this seduction. Harmon Blennerhassett was a tragic figure long before he met Aaron Burr. Born into the Anglo-Irish gentry, he was a man of immense wealth, but little practical sense. He was a scholar, a musician who played the cello, and a scientist who spent his days conducting experiments with electricity and chemistry. He was also a man running from a dark secret. He had married his own niece, Margaret Agnew, a scandal that had forced them to flee Ireland and the judgment of European society. They came to America, seeking solitude, and built their mansion on the island as a fortress against the world. They spent a fortune creating a bubble of refinement. Margaret, beautiful and accomplished, recited Shakespeare and rode thoroughbred horses. Harmon peered through his telescope and managed his investments. They were the royals of the river, living in a splendid isolation that was both protective and deeply lonely. This isolation was their fatal weakness. They were starved for intellectual conversation. They were starved for a connection to the great world they had left behind. When Aaron Burr, the former Vice President of the United States, a man of wit, elegance, and worldly fame, stepped onto their lawn, they were dazzled. It was as if a god had descended from Olympus to dine with mortals. They invited him in, opened their best wine, and lit the chandeliers. They had no idea that they were inviting a vampire across the threshold. The interaction between Burr and Blennerhassett is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Burr did not immediately ask for money or soldiers. That would have been too crude. Instead, he seduced Harmon's mind. He walked through the library praising Harmon's taste in literature. He listened to Harmon play the cello, complimenting his technique. He treated Harmon not as a strange recluse, but as a misunderstood genius who was wasting his talents in the wilderness. Once he had established this bond of intellectual intimacy, Burr began to plant the seeds of dissatisfaction. He whispered that a man of Harman's breeding and wealth deserved more than a lonely island. He spoke of the instability of the American government, suggesting that the Union was about to collapse. He painted a picture of the West not as a wild frontier, but as the cradle of a new glorious civilization. Burr employed the tactic of the mirror of desire. He held up a mirror to Harman, but the reflection he showed was not the awkward, nearsighted man Harman was, but the powerful statesman Harman wished to be. Burr hinted that in his new empire, the Empire of Mexico in the West, there would be a need for noblemen. There would be a need for ambassadors to the courts of Europe. Who better than Harman Blennerhassett to serve as the minister to the court of St. James? Who better to bring culture to the new capital in Mexico City? Harman Blennerhassett, a man who had been rejected by society his entire life, was intoxicated by this vision. For the first time, someone was offering him a purpose. Someone was offering him a way to redeem his name and elevate his wife to the station she deserved. He didn't just agree to the plan. He fell in love with it. He pledged his entire fortune to Aaron Burr. He mortgaged his island, sold his stocks, and handed over the keys to his paradise. By 1806, the island had transformed. The quiet sanctuary of art and science became a bustling military depot. This is where the detective work of history becomes tangible. We can look at the receipts, we can look at the contracts. The conspiracy was no longer just whispers in a library. It was wood, iron, and gunpowder. Burr and Blennerhassett contracted a local boat builder to construct a fleet of flatboats and keelboats. These were not small rafts. They were substantial vessels designed to carry hundreds of men, supplies, and weaponry down the Mississippi. They stockpiled barrels of pork, cornmeal, and whiskey. They purchased rifles, lead, and powder. The sheer scale of the logistical operation was staggering, but the most dangerous cargo was the human element. Burr began to recruit his adventurers. He put out calls in newspapers and taverns for young men of enterprise. He didn't tell them they were committing treason. He told them they were going to settle the Bastrop lands in Louisiana. He told them they were going to liberate Mexico from the Spanish tyranny. He promised them land, pay, and adventure. Young men flocked to the island. They were a motley crew of debtors, dreamers, and mercenaries. They camped on the manicured lawns of the Blennerhassett estate, drinking Harman's whiskey and cleaning their guns. The contrast was jarring, rough frontiersmen spitting tobacco on the Persian rugs, while Margaret Blennerhassett tried to maintain the facade of a genteel household. The island became a staging ground for a private war, a sovereign state operating within the borders of the United States. It would be a mistake to view Margaret Blennerhassett merely as a passive victim. Historical evidence suggests she was as captivated by Burr as her husband was. Margaret was a woman of high spirit and energy, bored by the quiet life of the river. Burr recognized this. He flirted with her, not necessarily romantically, but intellectually. He treated her as a queen in waiting. There is a tragic element to Margaret's involvement. She wrote a poem during this time titled "The Deserted Isle," as if she had a premonition of the doom that was coming. Yet, she pushed Harman forward. She encouraged him to invest more money. She defended Burr against the skeptics. She saw the empire as a way to secure a legacy for her children, to give them a title that would wipe away the stain of her incestuous marriage. Burr used Margaret as a lever against Harman. Whenever Harman hesitated, worrying about the risks or the dwindling funds, Burr would appeal to Margaret. He would paint a picture of her holding court in Mexico City, draped in jewels, respected by the world. Harman, who adored his wife, could deny her nothing. Thus, the entire family was weaponized against itself. The story of Blennerhassett Island serves as a philosophical case study in the contagious nature of corruption. Aaron Burr was a carrier of a psychological virus. He was hollowed out by his own ambition, and he sought to fill that void by consuming the substance of others. He found in the Blennerhassetts a perfect host. They had everything he lacked: money, stability, and innocence. Burr didn't just take their money. He took their reality. He replaced their peaceful existence with a fever dream of conquest. He made them complicit in a crime that could hang them. This is the dark power of the charismatic sociopath. They do not destroy you from the outside. They invite you to destroy yourself. They make you believe that your destruction is actually your salvation. By late 1806, the island was buzzing with the energy of imminent departure. The flatboats were nearly finished. The supplies were loaded. The army of the West was gathering. But secrets of this magnitude cannot be kept in a small community. The presence of armed men, the construction of the fleet, and the constant comings and goings of mysterious messengers began to attract attention. The Garden of Eden was about to be raided. The downfall of the conspiracy began not in Washington, but in the local taverns of Ohio and Virginia, now West Virginia. The neighbors were suspicious. Why was the eccentric Irishman building a navy? Why was the former vice president visiting so often? Why were young men with guns camping on the island? A local newspaper in Marietta, Ohio, began publishing a series of letters under the pseudonym The Curist. These letters asked pointed, dangerous questions. They asked if there was a plot to divide the Union. They asked if a private army was being raised to attack a foreign power. These letters were written by men loyal to President Jefferson, men who smelled treason in the air. At the same time, a federal agent named John Graham was dispatched by Jefferson to investigate. Graham arrived on the island posing as a sympathizer. He spoke to Harmon Blennerhassett, who, in his naive excitement, spilled everything. He told Graham about the plans for Mexico, about the separation of the West, about Burr's genius. Graham listened, nodded, and then reported every word back to Washington. The net was closing. The locals began to organize a militia to raid the island. The illusion of safety was shattering. Burr, sensing the danger, had already moved downriver to Nashville to recruit more men, leaving the Blennerhassetts to face the growing storm alone. He had used them, drained them, and now he was leaving them to hold the bag. On a snowy December night in 1806, Virginia's local militia was marching toward the river to seize the boats and capture the conspirators. Harmon Blennerhassett received the news just in time. In the ensuing panic, the emperor's ambassador had become a fugitive. Under the cover of darkness, with snow falling on the black water, Harmon and a small group of followers launched their boats. They fled their island, leaving behind the mansion, the library, the chemistry lab, and the life they had built. Margaret was left behind to follow later with the children, facing the wrath of the militia alone. When the militia arrived the next day, they found the birds had flown. In their frustration, they ransacked the mansion. They drank the wine cellar dry. They smashed the furniture. They burned the fences for firewood. The Garden of Eden was desecrated. The paradise was turned into a muddy ruin. Harmon Blennerhassett floated down the Ohio River, shivering in the cold, sailing toward a rendezvous with Burr at the mouth of the Cumberland River. He was no longer a wealthy aristocrat. He was a traitor on the run, his fortune gone, his home destroyed. He had bitten the apple offered by the serpent, and he had been cast out of the garden forever. In the rogues gallery of American history, there are traitors who act out of ideology, like Benedict Arnold, and there are traitors who act out of desperation, like Aaron Burr. But there is a third category, a category so dark and so purely selfish that it stands alone. It belongs to a man who wore the uniform of the highest-ranking officer in the United States Army while secretly accepting bags of gold coins from the King of Spain. His name was General James Wilkinson. He was a man of immense girth, immense appetite, and immense corruption. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner would later call him the most consummate artist in treason that the nation ever possessed. He was the commander-in-chief of the American military, the governor of the Louisiana Territory, and the closest ally Aaron Burr had in the world. Burr trusted Wilkinson with his life, his fortune, and his secrets. He believed they were partners in the grand design to carve out an empire. But Burr made a fatal error in judgment. He assumed that because Wilkinson was corrupt, he was also loyal to their shared corruption. He did not realize that a man who will sell his country for gold will also sell his friend for survival. General James Wilkinson was a paradox wrapped in a flamboyant uniform. Physically, he was a large, florid man who loved fine wines, rich foods, and the sound of his own voice. He projected an air of jovial authority, a Revolutionary War veteran who had stood beside Washington and Gates. But beneath the gold braid and the epaulets lay a soul of pure mercenary calculation. Wilkinson was a survivor. He had a unique talent for attaching himself to rising stars and then cutting them loose the moment they began to fall. He had intrigued against George Washington during the revolution in the Conway Cabal. He had speculated in land, swindled partners, and somehow always managed to fail upwards. By 1805, President Thomas Jefferson, who possessed a blind spot for Wilkinson, had appointed him the governor of the newly acquired Louisiana Territory. Jefferson believed Wilkinson was the perfect man to secure the frontier. He could not have been more wrong. He had essentially handed the keys of the American West to a wolf. For Aaron Burr, Wilkinson was the linchpin. A conspiracy of ideas is nothing without the muscle to enforce it. Wilkinson commanded the legions. He controlled the forts on the Mississippi. He had the power to start a war or stop one. Burr looked at Wilkinson and saw a mirror image of himself, ambitious, frustrated by the timid government in the East and willing to take risks. They were soulmates in corruption, two adventurers who believed they were destined for Caesar-like greatness. But Burr, for all his faults, operated on a code of aristocratic honor. He believed a gentleman's word was a bond. Wilkinson operated on the code of the rat, eat or be eaten. The true depth of Wilkinson's treachery was not fully revealed until a century after his death, when historians gained access to the Spanish archives in Madrid. There, buried in the dust of centuries, they found the receipts. For decades, while serving as an officer in the U.S. Army, James Wilkinson had been a paid spy for the Spanish Empire. In the secret correspondence of the Spanish intelligence service, he was known simply as Agent 13. Spain, terrified of American expansion into Mexico and Florida, paid Wilkinson handsomely to provide information on American troop movements and to sow discord in the West. He received an annual pension of $2,000, a fortune at the time, and extra payments for specific acts of sabotage. It is one of the most staggering conflicts of interest in history. The man charged with defending the American border against Spain was literally on the Spanish payroll. When Burr approached Wilkinson with his plan to invade Mexico, Wilkinson was placed in a delicious and dangerous position. On one hand, the invasion appealed to his greed. If they succeeded, he could be a viceroy in the new empire, claiming vast lands and wealth. On the other hand, he could report the plot to his Spanish masters to prove his loyalty to them. Or he could report the plot to Jefferson to prove his loyalty to America. He held 3 cards in his hand, and he played them all simultaneously, waiting to see which one would yield the biggest pot. He encouraged Burr, feeding his delusions of military support, while keeping one eye on the political winds in Washington. ready to jump ship the moment the water rose. Throughout 1805 and 1806, the correspondence between Burr and Wilkinson was frantic and intimate. They wrote to each other in complex ciphers, codes that substituted numbers and hieroglyphs for names and places, to hide their plans from postmasters and spies. These letters are the smoking guns of the conspiracy. In them, they spoke of the great enterprise. They spoke of moving troops to New Orleans. They spoke of the weakness of the imbecile government in Washington. Burr visited Wilkinson in St. Louis, the capital of the territory. We can imagine the scene. Two powerful men sitting in the governor's mansion late into the night, maps spread out on the table, brandy glasses in hand. Wilkinson, blustering and confident, assured Burr that the army was with them. He told Burr that the moment the flag was raised, the Western settlers would flock to their banner. He promised to provoke a war with Spain, creating the perfect pretext for their invasion. This promise was crucial. Burr knew he could not simply invade Mexico as a private citizen. That was piracy. But if the United States and Spain were at war, then an invasion was an act of patriotism. Wilkinson's role was to light the fuse. He was to march the army to the border and pick a fight. Burr left St. Louis convinced that the sword of the Republic was in his hand. He did not see the subtle smirk on Wilkinson's face, the look of a man who was already calculating the price of betrayal. In the autumn of 1806, the moment of truth arrived. The geopolitical tension on the Texas-Louisiana border was at a breaking point. Spanish troops had crossed the Sabine River, which was considered the boundary. This was the spark Wilkinson had promised. He marched the American army to the river, facing off against the Spanish forces. The war was hours away. Burr, waiting in Nashville and on Blennerhassett Island, prepared to launch his flotilla. But then, Agent 13 looked at the chessboard and realized he was in check. The Spanish commander facing him was not aggressive. He was looking to negotiate. More importantly, the political climate in the United States was shifting. Rumors of the conspiracy were appearing in newspapers. President Jefferson was receiving letters from loyal citizens warning him of treason. Wilkinson realized that if he started a war now and it went wrong, he would be blamed. If the conspiracy failed, he would hang alongside Burr. The instinct of self-preservation overrode the ambition of conquest. Wilkinson made a cold, lightning-fast calculation. He decided that the empire of the West was a sinking ship. To save himself, he had to become the hero who discovered the plot. He negotiated a hasty truce with the Spanish commander on the Sabine River, creating a neutral ground agreement that averted war. By signing that paper, he effectively killed Burr's invasion before it began. Without a war, Burr was just a filibuster. But Wilkinson wasn't done. He had to destroy the evidence of his own involvement, and the best way to do that was to scream treason, louder than anyone else. On October 8, 1806, while at his camp on the frontier, Wilkinson received the final fatal letter from Aaron Burr. It was delivered by a young messenger named Samuel Swartwout. This letter, known to history as the cipher letter, outlined the plan. Burr would be in Natchez by mid-December with up to 1,000 men. Wilkinson should be ready to move. Wilkinson took this letter and performed an act of forensic vandalism. He spent weeks decoding it. Then he deliberately altered the translation. He erased sentences that implicated himself. He changed the tone to make Burr sound more aggressive and more explicitly treasonous. He engineered a piece of evidence that placed the entire weight of the conspiracy on Burr's shoulders, while painting himself as the shocked, loyal general who had just uncovered a dastardly plot. He sent a hysterical letter to President Jefferson. He warned of a deep, dark, and wicked conspiracy that threatened to sever the Union. He claimed that thousands of armed bandits were descending the Mississippi to sack New Orleans. He positioned himself as the savior of the Republic, the only man standing between civilization and anarchy. It was a lie of monumental proportions. Burr had maybe 60 men, not thousands, but Jefferson, terrified and paranoid, believed it. Having sent the letter, Wilkinson raced to New Orleans to secure the city against the invasion. What followed was a reign of terror that foreshadowed modern military dictatorships. Wilkinson declared martial law. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He began arresting anyone who was friendly with Burr or who knew too much about Wilkinson's own past. He arrested Samuel Swartwout, the messenger, and Eric Bowman, another of Burr's agents. He didn't just put them in jail, he threw them in chains on military ships and deported them to Washington without trial. He seized private mail, he intimidated judges. When the local courts tried to challenge his authority, he threatened to arrest the judges too. The citizens of New Orleans were baffled. They saw no army of invaders. They saw only their own general acting like a tyrant. Wilkinson claimed he was protecting them from Burr, but in reality, he was sanitizing the crime scene. He was silencing witnesses. He was creating an atmosphere of panic so that when he finally caught Burr, no one would ask questions about Wilkinson's own complicity. He was burning the house down to hide the fact that he had helped to build it. From a detective's perspective, Wilkinson's maneuver was brilliant and despicable. He managed to play the United States against Spain and Burr against Jefferson, all while keeping his pension and his command. He knew that Burr would never betray him in return because Burr adhered to the gentleman's code of silence. Even when Burr was eventually captured and realized what Wilkinson had done, Burr refused to fully expose Wilkinson's Spanish connections because he lacked the hard proof, and perhaps because he was simply stunned by the magnitude of the betrayal. The tragedy for Burr was that he had bet everything on a man who had no soul. Burr believed in the camaraderie of the great men, that those with vision and daring shared a bond that transcended petty laws. Wilkinson proved that for the true survivor, there are no bonds, only leverage. While Burr was floating down the Mississippi, expecting to be greeted by Wilkinson's army with cheers and open arms, Wilkinson was actively preparing the chains. The double agent had become a triple agent. He had betrayed the U.S., he had betrayed Spain by not delivering the separation of the Union, and now he had betrayed his co-conspirator. Aaron Burr, unaware of the betrayal, is moving south with his small flotilla of boats. He believes he is sailing toward destiny. He believes Wilkinson is waiting in New Orleans to crown him. He is writing letters to Theodosia telling her that the dream is about to become reality. But in Washington, Thomas Jefferson has issued a proclamation declaring Burr a traitor. The news is spreading down the river valleys like wildfire. The militia is mobilizing. The hunters are loose. And in New Orleans, General James Wilkinson is polishing his sword, preparing to arrest the man he once called brother. The conspiracy has moved from the realm of political maneuvering to the realm of a manhunt. The Emperor of the West is about to become the most wanted man in America. And the man holding the handcuffs is the one man who should have been standing right beside him in the dock. History is often measured in grand armies, thundering cannons, and flags snapping in the wind. But the reality of rebellion is usually much quieter, wetter, and more pathetic. In the winter of 1806, the Grand Army of the Empire of the West, the force that was supposed to conquer Mexico, split the United States and crown Aaron Burr as emperor. Did not look like a Roman legion. It looked like a drift of garbage floating down a muddy river. It consisted of 9 rough flatboats. It carried fewer than 100 men, mostly naive boys from the backwoods, who thought they were going on a farming expedition. There were no uniforms. There were no brass bands. There was only the freezing rain of the Mississippi Valley and the silent, brooding figure of Aaron Burr, standing on the deck of the lead boat staring south. He was sailing into a void. He did not know that the man waiting for him in New Orleans was preparing handcuffs, not a coronation. He did not know that the president in Washington had already signed his political death warrant. In Burr's mind, and in the letters he wrote to Theodosia, he was commanding a formidable expedition. He spoke of thousands of men joining him along the way. He spoke of the inevitable momentum of history. But the detective looking at the manifest of the flotilla sees a different story. The boats that launched from the mouth of the Cumberland River in late December 1806 were essentially floating wooden boxes. They were slow, ungainly, and defenseless. The men on board were not hardened mercenaries. They were farm boys, sons of settlers, and young adventurers lured by the vague promise of land and glory. They brought with them farming tools, musical instruments, and domestic supplies. It looked less like an invasion force and more like a traveling circus or a migration of refugees. Burr moved among them with his signature charm, keeping the morale high. He was the captain of a ship of fools, but he played his role with Shakespearean commitment. He knew that the numbers were low, but he was banking on the magic of the river. He believed that as they moved south, passing through Tennessee and the Mississippi Territory, the discontented citizens of the frontier would flock to his banner. He believed that General Wilkinson was waiting in Natchez with the regular U.S. Army to join him. He was operating on the logic of a gambler who has lost his house but believes the next card will win it back. He wasn't seeing the muddy banks of the river. He was seeing the marble halls of Montezuma. While Burr was drifting slowly south, unaware of the storm breaking over his head, information was traveling fast. In Washington, Thomas Jefferson had finally acted. On November 27, 1806, Jefferson issued a proclamation. It did not name Burr explicitly, but it described a conspiracy to set on foot a military expedition against the dominions of Spain. It warned all good citizens to withdraw from the plot and authorized the military to seize the boats and arrest the conspirators. This proclamation was a master stroke of information warfare. It traveled ahead of Burr, carried by fast riders and river couriers. It arrived in the towns along the Mississippi weeks before Burr's slow-moving boats. Suddenly, the atmosphere on the river changed. The friendly taverns where Burr expected to be toasted were now filled with suspicion. The local militias who might have joined him were now polishing their muskets to arrest him. Burr was sailing into a hostile environment that he thought was friendly. He was like a man walking into a room thinking it is a surprise party in his honor, not realizing it is an intervention led by the police. The tragedy here is the lag in communication. In the 19th century, news traveled at the speed of a horse. Burr was living in the past, a past where he was a hero. The riverbanks were living in the present, a present where he was a traitor. The moment of truth arrived in January 1807, when the flotilla reached the Bayou Pierre, near the town of Natchez in the Mississippi Territory. Burr pulled his boats to the shore, expecting to receive word from Wilkinson. He was expecting a message saying, "The army is ready, come to New Orleans." Instead, he received a newspaper. In the columns of a local gazette, he read the contents of the cipher letter, the very letter he had sent to Wilkinson, now published and decoded by Wilkinson himself. He read Wilkinson's denunciation of the deep, dark, wicked conspiracy. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. It was a physical blow. The world collapsed. The Caesar realized that his Antony was actually Judas. Burr realized instantly that there was no army waiting for him. There was no war with Spain. There was only General Wilkinson in New Orleans, armed with the power of the state, waiting to arrest him and likely execute him to cover his own tracks. Burr's reaction was not rage, but a cold, terrifying clarity. He gathered his inner circle. He told them the truth. They had been betrayed. The great enterprise was dead. The mission now was not conquest, it was survival. The emperor vanished, and the fugitive emerged. Burr knew he could not surrender to Wilkinson. Wilkinson was a military tyrant who had suspended habeas corpus in New Orleans. If Burr fell into Wilkinson's hands, he would be court-martialed and shot or shipped to Washington in chains without a chance to speak. Burr needed the protection of the civil law. So in a brilliant legal maneuver, Burr surrendered not to the army, but to the civil authorities of the Mississippi Territory. He demanded a grand jury investigation. He bet on his own charisma and legal brilliance. And incredibly, he won. The scene in the Mississippi courthouse was surreal. The federal prosecutor demanded Burr's indictment for treason, but Burr stood up and charmed the jury. He argued that he had committed no act of war. He pointed to his boats. Where were the cannons? Where were the thousands of soldiers? He painted himself as a victim of Jefferson's persecution and Wilkinson's treachery. The grand jury, composed of Westerners who hated Wilkinson and the federal government, not only refused to indict Burr, they issued a statement condemning the arrest. It was a humiliating defeat for the government. Burr walked out of the courtroom a free man, technically, but he knew it was a hollow victory. Wilkinson was ignoring the courts. He had sent squads of soldiers to hunt Burr down, with orders to kidnap him if necessary. The law said Burr was free, but the bayonets said he was a dead man. Burr returned to his boats, but the atmosphere had curdled. His followers, the Blennerhassetts, the farm boys, looked at him with confusion and fear. They had signed up for glory. Now they were surrounded by militia branded as traitors and stuck in a swamp. Burr made the hardest decision of his life. He had to abandon them. If he stayed, his presence would draw the lightning down on everyone. If he fled, perhaps the government would let the small fish go and chase the whale. It was a rational decision, but it was also a profound moral failure. He was leaving the people he had seduced to face the consequences of his ambition. He called a final meeting. He told his men to hide the muskets in the mud. He told them to claim they were just settlers. Then on a windy night in February, Aaron Burr, the former vice president, the almost emperor, did something that shattered his dignity forever. He disguised himself. He took off his fine silk clothes, the clothes of a gentleman. He put on the ragged, dirty trousers of a riverboat man. He put on a battered beaver hat and a rough coat. He grew a scruffy beard. He tried to erase Aaron Burr. He slipped away into the darkness of the wilderness, accompanied by only one guide, riding a borrowed horse. He was heading for Spanish Florida, the only place where American law could not touch him. For weeks, Burr was a ghost moving through the pine forests of what is now Alabama. The government had put a massive bounty on his head. Every sheriff, every soldier, and every bounty hunter in the territory was looking for him. Imagine the psychological state of this man. He was riding through the rain, sleeping on the wet ground, eating whatever he could find. Only months ago, he was dreaming of sitting on a throne in Mexico City. Now he was terrified of every snapping twig. The fatal weakness of ambition had led him to the ultimate nadir. He was not Napoleon on Elba. He was a common outlaw on the run. Yet even in this state, Burr maintained a strange composure. He never panicked. He used his alias. He navigated by the stars. He was determined to reach the border. He was so close. He was within miles of Spanish territory when fate, which had toyed with him for so long, finally played its last card. The arrest of Aaron Burr is a scene straight out of a novel. He stopped at a small cabin in Wakefield, Alabama, to ask for directions. It was late at night. In the cabin was a young lawyer and militia officer named Nicholas Perkins. Perkins looked at the two strangers on horseback. One of them, the guide, did the talking. The other one, the man in the ragged clothes and the beaver hat, stayed back in the shadows. He looked like a beggar. But then he looked up. Perkins saw his eyes. Aaron Burr's eyes were legendary. They were black, brilliant, and piercing. They were the eyes of a man who commanded rooms. They were not the eyes of a riverboat man. Perkins also noticed the man's boots. Beneath the ragged pant legs, the man was wearing finely crafted, expensive leather boots. The detective in Perkins put it together instantly. This was the traitor. Perkins did not confront him there. He waited until they left, then gathered the sheriff and a posse. They chased Burr down and cornered him. When the sheriff shouted for him to surrender, Burr tried to talk his way out of it. He used his authority. He used his charm. But Perkins was relentless. "You are Aaron Burr," Perkins said. The game was up. Burr did not fight. He did not draw his pistols. He simply nodded. The emperor surrendered to a backwoods sheriff. The journey back to civilization was a humiliation ritual. Burr was not treated as a vice president. He was treated as a dangerous animal. He was placed under heavy guard. At one point, he tried to escape. He leaped from his horse and shouted to a group of citizens, "I am Aaron Burr, Vice President of the United States, and I claim your protection." The soldiers immediately aimed their muskets at him. The citizens stared in silence. No one moved to help him. Burr climbed back on his horse, weeping. It was the only time in the entire ordeal that he broke down. It was the realization that he was truly alone. The country he had helped build, the people he had tried to lead, viewed him as a monster. He was marched 1,000 miles to Richmond, Virginia. Why Richmond? Because that is where the trial would be held. President Jefferson was determined to make a spectacle of him. He wanted a show trial. He wanted to hang Burr to prove the strength of the federal government. Burr arrived in Richmond not as a conqueror, but as a prisoner in chains. The city was packed. People climbed onto roofs to get a glimpse of the traitor. The dream of the Empire of the West was buried in the mud of the Alabama wilderness. What remained was a legal battle for his life. In the sweltering heat of August 1807, the city of Richmond, Virginia became the center of the American universe. It was not a battle nor an election that drew the eyes of the nation, but a theater of law. The Eagle Tavern was overflowing with spectators, gamblers, and spies. The streets were packed with carriages carrying the most famous men in the Republic. A young Andrew Jackson was there, shouting on street corners that the defendant was a victim of persecution. A young Washington Irving was there, taking notes for a future book. And sitting in the hall of the House of Delegates, surrounded by a suffocating crowd, was Aaron Burr. He was on trial for his life. The charge was high treason. The penalty was death by hanging. But this was no ordinary criminal proceeding. It was a collision of the three titans of the American founding. In the White House, President Thomas Jefferson was orchestrating the prosecution, determined to hang his former vice president. On the bench, Chief Justice John Marshall, Jefferson's cousin and bitter political enemy, was determined to uphold the strict letter of the Constitution. And in the prisoner's dock, Aaron Burr, the greatest legal mind of his generation, was leading his own defense. It was the trial of the century, a gladiatorial combat where the weapon was not a sword, but the definition of a single word: treason. This was the final act of a blood feud that had simmered for decades. Thomas Jefferson did not merely want Aaron Burr convicted, he wanted him erased. Jefferson believed that Burr was a cancer on the body politic, a man of unbounded ambition who threatened the very existence of the Republic. From the executive mansion, Jefferson personally directed the prosecution, finding witnesses, offering pardons to co-conspirators, and publicly declaring Burr's guilt before the trial even began. In Jefferson's mind, the presumption of innocence was a luxury the state could not afford when dealing with a monster. Facing Jefferson from the bench was Chief Justice John Marshall. Marshall was a Federalist, a man who believed in the strength of the judiciary and despised Jefferson's populist rhetoric. Marshall knew that history was watching. If he allowed the president to use the courts to eliminate a political rival, the Constitution would be worth nothing more than the parchment it was written on. Marshall was not necessarily a friend of Burr. He viewed Burr as a profligate, but he was a devout servant of the law. He entered the courtroom knowing that every ruling he made would be scrutinized by a hostile president ready to impeach him if he stepped out of line. And then there was Burr. Despite the humidity, the chains, and the humiliation, Burr appeared in court every day dressed in a suit of impeccable black silk, his hair powdered, his manner calm and courteous. He did not look like a traitor. He looked like a king in exile. He treated the proceedings with a detached, almost ironic amusement. He knew that his life hung by a thread, but he also knew that in a courtroom, he was the master. He gathered a dream team of defense lawyers, but everyone knew who was really in charge. Aaron Burr was defending Aaron Burr, and he intended to put the United States of America on trial. The detective examining the legal strategy of the case finds that it hinged on a specific, deliberate choice of words made by the Founding Fathers 20 years earlier. Having lived under the tyranny of the British Crown, where treason could mean imagining the death of the king or speaking against the government, the founders had been terrified of constructive treason. They wanted to ensure that in the new America, political dissent could never be criminalized. Therefore, they wrote Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution with extreme precision. Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. This was Burr's shield. The prosecution had to prove that Burr had actually levied war. Not that he planned to levy war, not that he conspired to levy war, but that he had actually assembled an army and committed an act of violence. They also had to produce two witnesses who saw Burr do it. Burr's defense was simple and devastatingly logical. He argued that even if he had planned an empire, planning is not treason. Even if he had built boats, building boats is not levying war. And most importantly, on the day the act of war supposedly took place, the gathering on Blennerhassett Island, Aaron Burr wasn't even there. He was hundreds of miles away in Nashville. How could a man be present at a war when he was absent from the battlefield? It was a legal knot that the prosecution, led by the fervent George Hay, struggled desperately to untie. The dramatic high point of the trial was the arrival of the star witness, General James Wilkinson. The double agent had arrived in Richmond with all the pomp of a conquering hero, but the crowd saw him for what he was. Washington Irving described Wilkinson as swelling like a turkey cock, a man so bloated with vanity and fear that he seemed ready to burst. When Wilkinson entered the courtroom to take the stand, Aaron Burr turned and looked at him. The courtroom went silent. It was a look of such withering contempt, such profound dissection, that observers noted Wilkinson visibly shrank. The general began his testimony, weaving a tale of a dark, massive conspiracy involving thousands of men and British gold. He read the famous cipher letter into the record, claiming it proved Burr's guilt. But Burr's defense team, particularly the bulldog lawyer Luther Martin, was ready. They didn't just cross-examine Wilkinson, they eviscerated him. They forced him to admit that he had altered the cipher letter. They forced him to admit that he had arrested men without trial in New Orleans. They hammered him on his connections to Spain. By the time Wilkinson stepped down from the stand, he was sweating profusely, his credibility in tatters. He had come to Richmond to bury Burr. Instead, he narrowly escaped being indicted by the grand jury himself. The jury looked at the general and looked at the prisoner, and they realized that the man in the uniform was the greater villain. In the middle of the trial, Aaron Burr made a move of such audacity that it stunned the legal world. He realized that to prove his innocence, he needed documents that were held by Thomas Jefferson himself, specifically letters from Wilkinson that would prove the general's duplicity. Burr asked the court to issue a subpoena duces tecum to the President of the United States. It was a constitutional crisis in real time. Could a court order the president to release papers? Jefferson was furious. He argued that the president was not a common citizen and could not be dragged into court at the whim of a traitor. He argued for executive privilege, though the term didn't exist yet. Chief Justice Marshall, in a ruling that established a precedent for centuries to come, echoing all the way to United States versus Nixon, ruled in Burr's favor. He declared that in America, no man is above the law, not even the president. Jefferson, seething with rage, refused to appear in person but agreed to release the documents. It was a massive symbolic victory for Burr. He had forced the president to bow to the court. He had turned the tables, making it look as though Jefferson was hiding the truth. As the long, hot summer dragged on, the prosecution presented over 140 witnesses. They testified about the boats, the guns, the conversations about Mexico. But they could not produce the two witnesses required by the Constitution to prove that Burr had levied war on Blennerhassett Island. Every witness admitted that Burr was not there. Finally, Chief Justice Marshall delivered his opinion. It was a masterwork of legal reasoning and a death blow to the prosecution's case. Marshall ruled strictly on the definition of treason. He declared that conspiracy to levy war is not treason. He declared that to be guilty of treason, the accused must be physically present at the assembly of force. Since Burr was not on the island, he could not be a principal traitor. At most, he was an accessory. But under American law, you cannot try an accessory until the principal, in this case, Harmon Blennerhassett, has been convicted. The logic was ironclad. Marshall had effectively directed the jury to acquit. He had placed the sanctity of the Constitution above the passions of the moment. He knew that by doing so he would be burned in effigy alongside Burr, but he did not flinch. He saved Aaron Burr's life to save the American legal system from becoming a tool of political purging. On September 1st, 1807, the jury returned after a brief deliberation, but they did not deliver a simple verdict. The foreman stood up and read a statement that was as much an insult as it was an acquittal. We of the jury say that Aaron Burr is not proved to be guilty under this indictment by any evidence submitted to us. We therefore find him not guilty. It was a Scotch verdict, not proven rather than innocent. It was a slap in the face. Burr leaped to his feet and objected. He demanded the verdict be entered simply as not guilty. Marshall agreed and fixed the record, but the damage was done. The jury had spoken for the American people. The law says you are free, but we know you are a scoundrel. Burr walked out of the courtroom, a free man, but he was stripped of his honor. He had won the legal battle, but he had lost the war for his reputation. There were no cheers in the streets, only sullen silence and the muttering of threats. The man who had been vice president was now legally innocent, but socially dead. The acquittal did not quench the public's thirst for blood, it only intensified it. The narrative that had been spun by Jefferson and Wilkinson, that Burr was a traitor who escaped on a technicality, took hold of the national consciousness. In Baltimore, a mob gathered on Gallows Hill. They constructed elaborate effigies of Aaron Burr and Harmon Blenner Hassett. They also made an effigy of Chief Justice John Marshall. They marched these figures through the streets, cursing them, and then set them on fire. It was a visceral display of hatred. The mob could not hang the man, so they burned his ghost. Burr, realizing that his life was in danger, went into hiding. He lived in the attic of a friend's house in Baltimore, terrified of being recognized. He began to use the alias Mr. Edwards. The former vice president, the man who had almost been emperor, was now forced to skulk in the shadows of the very country that had acquitted him. He realized that the United States was no longer his home. It was a prison where everyone was a warden. Aaron Burr proved that the law is a technical instrument, a machine of logic that protects the individual against the state. But he also learned that justice is a social construct, a feeling in the gut of the mob. The law acquitted him, but society condemned him. Burr stood in the wreckage of his life. His political career was ash. His fortune was gone, spent on boats and lawyers. His name was a curse word. He had only one thing left, his daughter, Theodosia. She had stood by him throughout the trial, her loyalty the only light in his darkness. But even she could not protect him from the hatred of millions. He realized he had to leave. He had to flee, not just the state, but the continent. He looked toward Europe, the old world, hoping that perhaps there, among the kings and emperors he so admired, he might find a second act. He packed his bags not as a traveler, but as an exile. The man without a country was about to drift into the void of the Atlantic. In the winter of 1810, in a freezing, drafty garret in Paris, a small man sat huddled by a dying fire. He was wrapped in a threadbare coat, his boots were leaking, and he had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. To the landlord, he was just another eccentric, impoverished American gentleman named Mr. Arnaud. To the women of the Parisian night, he was a charming but broke older lover. But to history, he was Aaron Burr, the former vice president of the United States, the man who had tied Thomas Jefferson for the presidency, the slayer of Alexander Hamilton, and the failed emperor of the West. The fall from grace was absolute. 10 years earlier, he had presided over the U.S. Senate. Now, he was counting copper coins to buy a roasted potato from a street vendor. He was a man without a country, a fugitive wandering the earth, trying to sell a broken dream to emperors who wouldn't even grant him an audience. It is a study of a man who refused to break, even when the entire world had conspired to crush him, and who kept himself alive with a singular burning obsession, the hope of seeing his daughter one last time. After the acquittal in Richmond and the subsequent burning of his effigies by the Baltimore mob, Aaron Burr realized that America was no longer a home. It was a hunting ground. He was legally free, but socially executed. Creditors were circling to throw him in debtor's prison, and political enemies were looking for an excuse to try him again on different charges. In June of 1808, under the cover of darkness, he boarded a packet ship in New York Harbor. He did not travel as Aaron Burr. He traveled under the alias H.E. Edwards. The psychological weight of this departure was crushing. He was leaving behind the only person who mattered to him, Theodosia. Their farewell was a scene of agonizing sorrow. Theodosia, already frail and battling her own illnesses, stood on the dock as her father, the center of her universe, sailed into the void. Burr believed this exile would be temporary. He believed he would go to Europe, charm the courts of London and Paris, secure funding for his Mexican empire, and return in triumph. It was the last great delusion of his life. As the American coastline faded into the mist, Burr was sailing not toward a new beginning, but toward a 4-year purgatory of humiliation. Burr arrived in London with the optimism of a gambler who believes his luck is about to turn. He assumed that the British government, which had flirted with his treasonous plans in 1804, would still be interested. He sought out the intellectuals and the power brokers. He charmed Jeremy Bentham, the famous philosopher of utilitarianism, who was so taken with Burr that he invited the exile to live in his house. For a brief moment, it seemed like the old Burr magic was working. He was dining in salons, discussing philosophy and playing the role of the misunderstood statesman. But the political doors remained firmly locked. The British government had changed. Lord Castlereagh and the Foreign Office viewed Burr not as an asset, but as a dangerous liability. They knew that supporting Burr would infuriate the United States, and Britain was already on the brink of war with America, which would become the War of 1812. Burr was treated like a radioactive isotope. When he tried to present his maps and plans for the invasion of Mexico, he was met with polite silence or cold rejection. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The Spanish government, allied with Britain against Napoleon, demanded Burr's expulsion. In April 1809, the British government issued a warrant for his arrest and deportation. The former vice president was rousted from his bed by police officers, his papers were seized, and he was told to leave the country. He was kicked out of the land of his ancestors, forced to drift once again. He looked toward the only power left on the continent that might listen to him, Napoleon Bonaparte. Burr traveled to Sweden, then Germany, and finally arrived in Paris in 1810. His goal was simple and audacious. He wanted an audience with the Emperor Napoleon. He believed that if he could just get 10 minutes with the Corsican genius, he could convince him that an invasion of the United States and Mexico was in France's best interest. He drafted elaborate memorials outlining how a French fleet could liberate the American South or seize the Spanish colonies. But Burr was operating on outdated intelligence. Napoleon had no interest in a North American adventure. He was bogged down in Spain and preparing for the disastrous invasion of Russia. To Napoleon's ministers, Burr was a nuisance. Talleyrand, the brilliant and cynical French foreign minister, remembered Burr from his own time in America. Talleyrand had once visited Burr's home in New York, but now, holding the levers of European power, he refused to even acknowledge Burr's presence. He famously instructed his secretaries that if Mr. Burr called, he was to be told that the minister was busy forever. Burr spent months sitting in the waiting rooms of minor bureaucrats, clutching his maps, being passed from one underling to another. The American Napoleon was being ignored by the real Napoleon. The silence from the Tuileries Palace was a crushing verdict on Burr's relevance. He had ceased to be a player in history. He was now merely a petitioner, a ghost shouting at the walls of power. As his political hopes evaporated, so did his money. Burr had arrived in Europe with funds provided by wealthy friends, but those funds ran dry. He found himself trapped in Paris, unable to afford passage home, unable to afford decent lodgings, and unable to afford food. The winter of 1810 to 1811 was brutal. The man who had once owned the finest wine cellar in New York was now living on a diet of bread, cheese, and roasted potatoes. We have a window into this suffering through his private journal. It is a harrowing document. He records days where he walked miles through the snow because his boots had holes in them, and he couldn't afford a carriage. He records moments of dizziness from hunger. He describes shivering in his unheated room, wrapping himself in old coats, trying to summon the energy to write another futile letter to a minister. Yet incredibly, the journal is not a document of self-pity. It is a document of stoicism. Burr writes about his poverty with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. He treats his hunger as an experiment. He finds humor in his degradation. One entry describes him searching his pockets and finding a single coin, celebrating it as a triumph. He maintained his dignity by refusing to beg openly, keeping up the appearance of a gentleman even as his body wasted away. This resilience is the most admirable and tragic quality of his character. He refused to let the world see him bleed. The private journal of Aaron Burr during his exile is one of the most unique documents in American history. It reveals the duality of the man in stark relief. Alongside the descriptions of poverty and political maneuvering, Burr catalogs his sexual conquests with the precision of an accountant. Even in his 50s, broke and ragged, Burr possessed a magnetism that women found irresistible. He seduced countesses, chambermaids, and prostitutes alike. He recorded these encounters in code, noting the cost and the pleasure. To a modern reader, this might seem like the behavior of a degenerate, but the detective sees something else. It was a desperate affirmation of life. In a world that told him he was dead, politically, socially, financially, sex was the one realm where he was still Aaron Burr. It was a way to assert control, to feel power, to momentarily escape the cold reality of his garret. But intertwined with the hedonism are passages of profound, heart-wrenching sorrow. He writes to Theodosia every night. These entries are not meant for the public. They are conversations with his soul. He worries about her health. He asks about his grandson, Aaron Burr Alston. He confesses his loneliness. The world is a blank without thee, he writes. The contrast between the sordid details of his Parisian nightlife and the pure, elevated love he held for his daughter creates a portrait of a deeply fractured man, holding on to sanity by a single thread. By 1811, Burr wanted only one thing: to go home. He gave up on the empire. He gave up on Napoleon. He just wanted to see Theodosia before he died. But he discovered that leaving France was harder than entering it. He was caught in a bureaucratic nightmare. The American ambassador in Paris, Jonathan Russell, despised Burr and refused to issue him a passport. He claimed that Burr was a fugitive from U.S. law, which was technically untrue, as he had been acquitted, but legally murky. Simultaneously, the French government refused to grant him an exit visa without a passport. Burr was a prisoner of the state, trapped in a catch-22. He spent months writing petitions, waiting in lines, and pulling every string he had left. He was watched by spies from both countries. The U.S. government feared he was plotting a return to cause trouble. The French feared he was a British spy. Burr felt the walls closing in. He wrote in his journal about the sensation of being buried alive. He was a man without a country, claimed by no one, protected by no one. He began to sell his few remaining possessions, his watch, his books, even little gifts he had bought for Theodosia, just to pay the bribes required to get his papers stamped. It is in this crucible of Paris that Burr's philosophy was fully forged. He adopted a radical form of stoicism. He formulated a maxim: never complain, never explain. He believed that the universe was governed by a chaotic fate, and that the only control a man had was over his own reaction. He refused to show weakness to his enemies. When he encountered Americans in Paris who snubbed him, he greeted them with a polite bow and a smile, driving them mad with his refusal to be shamed. He wrote to Theodosia, "I am not sinking. On the contrary, I float effortlessly on the waves that threaten to drown me." This was not just bravado, it was a survival strategy. If he acknowledged the horror of his situation, he might collapse. So he chose to view his life as a grand, absurd comedy. He laughed at the holes in his boots. He laughed at the ministers who ignored him. He turned his tragedy into an intellectual exercise, observing the fall of a vice president as if he were watching a play, not living it. Finally, in the summer of 1811, a crack appeared in the wall. Through the intervention of a French friend, the Duke of Bassano, Burr managed to secure a slip of paper that allowed him to leave France. But the American ambassador still refused a passport. Burr had to travel to Holland and find a ship captain willing to take him without proper papers. He found a ship called the Vigilant. It was a fitting name. He boarded it penniless, heavily in debt, disguised in a wig and false name to avoid creditors who were trying to seize him at the dock. As the ship pulled away from the European coast, Burr stood at the rail, looking back at the continent that had rejected him. He had spent 4 years wandering the wilderness. He had dined with philosophers and starved in garrets. He had tried to sell an empire and had ended up selling his watch. He was sailing back to a country that hated him, to a city where he faced imprisonment for debt. But he didn't care. He was sailing toward Theodosia. The man without a country was returning to the only territory that had ever truly accepted him, the heart of his daughter. He believed the worst was over. He believed that the gods of tragedy had finally exhausted their cruelty. He was wrong. The Atlantic Ocean was not a bridge to happiness. It was the setting for the final, most devastating act of the drama. In May 1812, Aaron Burr landed in Boston Harbor. He did not arrive with the fanfare of a returning statesman. He arrived like a stowaway. He was listed on the ship's manifest as Mr. Arnott. He wore a wig to disguise his identity, terrified that his creditors, or worse, federal agents, might recognize him before he could reach the safety of New York. He was 56 years old, penniless, and carrying nothing but a few trunks of books he had collected in Europe. The detective of history notes the humiliation of this moment. The man who once lived in the mansion at Richmond Hill had to pawn his encyclopedias just to buy a ticket for the stagecoach. He moved through the shadows of New England, a ghost haunting the country he had helped to found. When he finally arrived in New York City, he slipped unnoticed into a modest boarding house on Nassau Street. He put up a small brass plaque that read simply, "Aaron Burr, Attorney at Law." It was a restart from zero. But remarkably, the city did not reject him. His old clients remembered his brilliance. They didn't care about the treason or the duel. They cared that he could win cases. Slowly, miraculously, money began to trickle in. He began to rebuild a life, but this resurrection was merely the setup for the fall. Fate allowed him to regain his footing just so it could knock him down harder than ever before. He wrote to Theodosia immediately, telling her that the exile was over, that the darkness had lifted, and that they would soon be reunited to live out their days in peace. The first blow landed before Theodosia could even pack her bags. In the summer of 1812, just weeks after Burr's return, a letter arrived from South Carolina. It was from his son-in-law, Governor Joseph Alston. The handwriting was shaky, the tone frantic. It brought the news that Aaron Burr Alston, Burr's 10-year-old grandson and only heir, was dead. The boy had succumbed to the country fever, likely malaria, which plagued the swampy low country of the South. This was not just the death of a child, it was the death of the dream. Throughout the entire conspiracy, throughout the trials and the exile, Burr had justified his ambition with the thought of this boy. He was building the Empire of the West not for himself, but for Gampy, as the boy affectionately called him. He wanted to leave a throne, or at least a vast fortune, to this child who carried his name in his blood. When Burr read the letter, the stoic mask he had worn for years finally cracked. He realized that the empire was truly dust. There was no dynasty. There was no future. All that remained was the present grief. But Burr, ever the philosopher of endurance, swallowed his pain. He knew that the one person suffering more than him was Theodosia. The boy had been her entire world. Without him, she was drifting into a profound suicidal depression. Burr knew he had to save her. He urged her to come north immediately. He believed that the cool air of New York and the embrace of her father were the only things that could keep her alive. The logistics of bringing Theodosia to New York were complicated by war. The War of 1812 had broken out between the United States and Great Britain. The Atlantic was swarming with British warships implementing a naval blockade. Travel by land was too arduous for the frail Theodosia, who was weak with grief and illness. The sea was the only option, but it was a gauntlet of dangers. Burr sent his trusted friend and doctor, Timothy Green, down to South Carolina to escort her. Governor Alston, worried about his wife's safety, secured passage on a privateer schooner named the Patriot. This was not a lumbering passenger ship. It was a sleek, fast pilot boat, armed with guns and built to outrun the British blockade. It was commanded by Captain William Overstocks, an experienced sailor who knew the hidden currents of the coast. To ensure her safety, Governor Alston wrote a letter to the British admiral, commanding the blockade, begging for safe passage for his wife, a non-combatant. He placed Theodosia, her maid, Dr. Green, and her trunks of clothes and letters on board. On December 30th, 1812, the Patriot weighed anchor from Georgetown, South Carolina. Theodosia stood on the deck, dressed in mourning black, waving goodbye to her husband. She was sailing toward the father she had not seen in 4 years. She was sailing toward a reunion that became the most anticipated event of Burr's life. The ship turned its prow north, disappeared past the horizon, and sailed out of history. The voyage from South Carolina to New York should have taken 5 or 6 days. Aaron Burr began his vigil at the Battery on the tip of Manhattan in early January 1813. Every morning, he walked down to the waterfront. He stood there, wrapped in his coat against the winter wind, scanning the gray waters of the harbor. He watched ships arrive from Boston, from Philadelphia, from Europe. He asked captains for news. A week passed, then 2, then 3. The silence began to grow loud. Rumors started to circulate on the docks. Some said a massive storm had struck the coast off Cape Hatteras shortly after New Year's. Others whispered about British frigates capturing American schooners. Burr refused to listen. He maintained a terrifying optimism. He told friends that the ship must have put into a port in Bermuda for repairs. He told them she was likely delayed by the blockade. But as January turned to February, the hope began to look like madness. The other ships that had sailed around the same time had arrived. The Patriot was the only one missing. It had not been captured by the British. There was no record of it in their admiralty logs. It had not put into any port. It had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The realization began to settle on Burr like a heavy stone. She was not coming. What happened to the Patriot? The most plausible theory for the rational historian is the weather. The shoals off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, are known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. It is where the warm Gulf Stream collides with cold currents, creating sudden, violent storms. Records show that a severe gale blew through the area in the first week of January 1813. The detective reconstructs the scene. The small, fast schooner running with all sails set to beat the British blockade hits the storm in the middle of the night. The waves at Hatteras can reach 30 feet. Perhaps the ship was dismasted. Perhaps it broached and capsized instantly, trapping Theodosia in her cabin. In this scenario, there was no malice, only the indifferent violence of nature. The ocean that Burr had crossed to escape his treason had now reached up and taken his payment. However, a darker theory haunted the American imagination for decades, and it haunted Burr too. The waters off the Carolinas were not just dangerous because of wind, they were dangerous because of men. The bankers were land pirates who used lanterns on horses to lure ships onto the treacherous sandbars. Once a ship ran aground, the bankers would storm aboard, murder the crew to eliminate witnesses, and loot the cargo. Even more chilling were the confessions that emerged years later. In the 1830s, 2 criminals executed in Norfolk, Virginia, confessed to having been crew members on the Patriot. They claimed the crew had mutinied and turned pirate. Another story surfaced involving the famous pirate Jean Lafitte. A legend grew that pirates had intercepted the ship. According to this macabre folklore, Theodosia was forced to walk the plank. The image is vivid and horrific. The daughter of the former vice president, dressed in her white nightgown or her mourning black, standing on a wooden board over the icy Atlantic. She asks for no mercy, displaying the stoicism of her father. She calmly steps off into the abyss. While most historians dismiss these confessions as jailhouse fabrications seeking notoriety, the mere possibility tormented Burr. He lived with the nightmare that his daughter did not die quickly in a storm, but died in terror at the hands of violent men who represented the very lawlessness he had tried to exploit in the West. When it became undeniable that the ship was lost, Aaron Burr did not scream. He did not throw himself into the river. He shut down. He famously said, "I feel severed from the human race." This is the ultimate tragedy of his life. He had lost his parents as a child. He had lost his wife. He had lost his career. He had lost his reputation. He had lost his grandson. And now he had lost Theodosia. He was completely, utterly alone. The universe had systematically stripped away every single connection he had to humanity. Yet he continued to live. He continued to work. He walked to his office every day. He took cases. He argued in court. But those who knew him said the light behind his black eyes had gone out. He was a biological machine going through the motions of life. He refused to wear mourning clothes. He refused to speak her name. He locked her memory in a vault deep inside his mind, alongside the memories of the duel and the conspiracy. He became a stoic statue, impervious to further pain because there was nothing left to hurt. In Greek tragedy, Nemesis is the goddess who enacts retribution against those who succumb to hubris, arrogance before the gods. Aaron Burr's hubris was his belief that he could shape the world to his will, that he could carve out empires and defy the laws of nations. The punishment for such ambition was not death. Death would have been too easy. The punishment was survival. He was condemned to live on while everything he built and everyone he loved was destroyed. He had wanted an empire of the West to leave to his daughter. Fate's irony was to take the daughter and leave him with nothing but the dust of his maps. He had tried to tear a country apart. In return, the ocean tore his family apart. He stood at the battery, an old man in a fading coat staring at the gray line where the sky met the sea, waiting for a ship that existed only in the past. He was the emperor of nothing. In the bustling, expanding metropolis of New York City in the 1830s, amidst the carriages, the steamships, and the rising smoke of industry, there walked a figure that seemed to belong to a different time. He was a small, stooped old man in a threadbare black coat, moving with a cane, but possessing a gaze that was still unsettlingly sharp. Mothers would pull their children close when he passed. Men would cross the street to avoid tipping their hats. In the taverns, whispers would follow his wake like the tail of a comet. "That's him," they would say. "That's the man who killed Hamilton. That's the traitor." Aaron Burr had outlived everyone. He had outlived his wife, his daughter, his grandson, his enemies, and his friends. He had outlived the founding fathers, Jefferson, Adams, Washington, and he had outlived his own era. He was a relic of the Revolution wandering through the age of Jackson, a living ghost haunting the city he had once helped to build. For 23 years after the death of Theodosia, Burr refused to die. He lived on in a state of defiant purgatory, practicing law, seducing women, and staring down a world that wished he would simply disappear. It is the final verdict on the man who tried to tear America apart, and the question of whether he was a monster or simply the only man honest enough to admit that America was built on ambition. To the detective of history, the most remarkable fact about Aaron Burr's later years is not his misery, but his resilience. After returning from Europe and accepting the loss of Theodosia, Burr did not retreat into a monastery. He returned to the arena. He was broke, he was 60 years old, and he was a pariah. Yet within weeks of arriving in New York, he opened a law office at 23 Nassau Street, and incredibly, the clients came. They were not the wealthy merchants or the politicians of his youth. Those doors were closed forever. His new clients were the outcasts, the mechanics, the soldiers fighting for pensions, and the poor landholders fighting eviction. They came to him because despite the treason and the murder, everyone knew that Aaron Burr was the sharpest legal mind in the country. If you were in trouble and if society hated you, you went to the man society hated most. Burr worked with a manic intensity. He rose at dawn and worked until midnight. He lived in a chaotic clutter of papers, sleeping on a hard sofa in his office. He made money, good money, but he gave it away as fast as he earned it. He supported a legion of orphans, illegitimate children, and old friends who had fallen on hard times. He was a man trying to buy redemption $1 at a time, or perhaps he simply didn't care about wealth anymore. To the society of New York, he was the undead. He was a man who had been socially executed, but refused to lie down in his grave. He walked Broadway with his head high, meeting the glare of his enemies with a terrifying stoic smile. If Burr's life was a tragedy, his final act contained a subplot of dark comedy. In 1833, at the age of 77, Aaron Burr decided to marry again. His bride was Eliza Jumel, the wealthiest widow in America. Madame Jumel was a character as colorful as Burr himself. Rumored to be a former prostitute who had risen through society by her wits, she lived in the Morris Jumel mansion in Harlem and possessed a fortune that dazzled the city. The marriage was a transaction of pure vanity on both sides. Eliza Jumel wanted the legitimacy of a title. She wanted to be the wife of a former vice president, to compel the snobs of New York to bow to her. Aaron Burr wanted her money. He was drowning in debt, and he saw her fortune as a way to fund his final schemes. The wedding took place in the parlor of her mansion. The groom was 77, the bride was 58. It was a disaster from the moment the vows were spoken. Within days, the old serpent returned to his habits. He began to liquidate her assets. And here is where the empire motif returns for one last ghostly bow. Burr took Eliza's money and invested it in land speculation in Texas. Even at the door of death, he was still looking west. He was still dreaming of a new country, a German colony in Texas that would serve as a buffer state. The dream of the empire had never truly left him. It had just gone underground. When Eliza discovered he was spending her fortune on Texas land schemes, She filed for divorce. The divorce proceedings were humiliating. She accused him of adultery, which, incredibly for a man of 78, was likely true. And in a twist of irony that no novelist would dare invent, the lawyer Eliza hired to represent her was Alexander Hamilton Jr., the son of the man Burr had killed. The ghost of Weehawken had returned to preside over the wreckage of Burr's final marriage. The divorce was the final farce, but the body was finally giving out. In 1834, Burr suffered a massive stroke that left him paralyzed on his right side. The man of perpetual motion was suddenly frozen. He lost the ability to walk, and his handwriting, once elegant and precise, became a jagged scrawl. He was moved from boarding house to boarding house, cared for by a cousin and a few loyal friends. He eventually settled in a room at Weenant's Inn in Port Richmond, Staten Island. It was a modest establishment overlooking the water. There is a profound symbolism in this location. He spent his days sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the harbor. He was watching the same water that had taken Theodosia. In these final years, the monster became a curiosity. Young men, aspiring lawyers and historians, would make the pilgrimage to Staten Island to see the last of the Romans. They expected to find a bitter, raging villain. Instead, they found a courteous, witty old man who refused to speak ill of his enemies. When asked about Hamilton, Burr would simply say, "He was a gentleman, but a man of loose principles." When asked about Jefferson, he would smile enigmatically. He adhered strictly to his code: never complain, never explain. He refused to give the world the satisfaction of seeing him suffer. As death approached, the religious community of New York became obsessed with the state of Aaron Burr's soul. Ministers descended upon the boarding house like vultures, eager to secure the confession of the century. They wanted him to repent. They wanted him to admit that he was a sinner, a murderer, and a traitor. They wanted the satisfaction of seeing the proud Stoic crumble before the fear of hell. Burr received them with polite hospitality, but he refused to play their game. When a reverend asked him if he hoped for salvation, Burr replied with a cryptic, "On that subject, I am coy." He did not believe in the fiery hell of the Calvinists. He believed in a God, but he viewed God as a great and good being who would judge him on the totality of his life, not on the prejudices of his neighbors. He refused to repent for the duel. In his mind, the duel was an affair of honor, conducted according to the rules of the time. To repent would be to admit cowardice. He refused to repent for the treason. In his mind, he had tried to liberate the West, not destroy the East. He went to his deathbed holding on to his own narrative, refusing to let the priests write his epitaph. On September 14, 1836, the end finally came. It was the same day that the divorce from Madame Jumel was officially finalized. Burr was 80 years old. As the light faded from the room in Staten Island, he reportedly turned to his doctor and whispered, "Madame." He was likely hallucinating Theodosia, seeing her waiting for him on the other side of the veil. He died quietly, without a struggle. The fiery ambition that had driven him to storm Quebec in the snow, to tie for the presidency, to shoot a founding father, and to try to steal a continent, finally flickered out. The American Napoleon was dead in a rented room, leaving behind nothing but debts and a few trunks of letters. But the detective notices a strange detail about his death mask. The plaster cast taken of his face shows a man with a slight ironic smile. It is the face of a man who knows a secret. Perhaps the secret was that he had lived life on his own terms, and that, while history would judge him, it could never tame him. The final journey of Aaron Burr was a return to his origins. He was not buried in New York, nor in the West. He was taken to Princeton, New Jersey. This was the college his father had presided over, and where his grandfather, the fiery preacher Jonathan Edwards, was buried. The funeral was a surreal event. The president of the college preached the sermon. The student body, oblivious to the nuances of history, turned out to see the famous villain. He was laid to rest in the president's lot, right beside his father and grandfather. It was a jarring juxtaposition. There lay Jonathan Edwards, the holiest man in American history, the sinner in the hands of an angry God. And right next to him lay Aaron Burr, the sinner who angered the gods of America. Burr was buried with full military honors, a final nod to his service in the Revolutionary War, the one part of his life that even his enemies could not deny. But for years, there was no headstone. His grave was anonymous, a patch of grass that people would point to and whisper about. It was only years later that a relative placed a simple marble stone. To this day, visitors to the Princeton Cemetery leave coins on Hamilton's grave in New York, but they leave bullets or whiskey bottles on Burr's grave in New Jersey. As we stand over the grave of Aaron Burr, we must deliver the final verdict of this investigation. Was he a traitor who wanted to tear America apart? Yes. The evidence of the boats, the codes, and the maps is undeniable. He wanted to be a king. He wanted to steal Mexico. But was he the monster that Jefferson and Hamilton painted? Aaron Burr was the mirror of the American soul that America didn't want to look into. He represented the raw, unvarnished ambition that built the country. He represented the idea that land belongs to the bold, that laws are merely suggestions, and that the individual is greater than the state. Hamilton and Jefferson wanted to build a structured, virtuous republic. Burr wanted to build an empire of glory. America eventually became exactly what Burr wanted, an empire that stretched from sea to shining sea, that took Mexican land in 1846, and that celebrated the self-made man. Burr's crime wasn't that he had the wrong vision. His crime was that he was too early, and he tried to do it alone. The story of Aaron Burr is the story of the road not taken. It is the shadow history of the United States. We like to tell ourselves that the Founding Fathers were statues of marble, united in wisdom. Burr proves they were men of flesh, blood, and murderous rage. He is the fallen star of the founding generation. He possessed more brilliance, more charm, and more talent than almost any of them. But he lacked the one thing that sustains a legacy, a cause greater than himself. Washington fought for liberty. Jefferson fought for democracy. Hamilton fought for order. Aaron Burr fought for Aaron Burr. And so he died alone, looking out at the ocean, waiting for a daughter who was already dust. The empire of the West was never built. The throne of Mexico remained empty. But in the quiet corners of American history, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whisper of the flatboats on the river, the scratch of the quill-writing ciphers in the night, and the echo of the pistol shot that proved that even the greatest men can be destroyed by a single moment of pride. And that is the tragic, terrifying, and suppressed story of Aaron Burr, the hero of the Revolution, the killer of Hamilton, the traitor of the West. He wanted to be the American emperor. Instead, he became the American ghost. His life asks us a terrifying question. What is the difference between a visionary and a traitor? Is it the morality of the plan, or is it simply who wins? If you're interested in delving deeper into some of the darkest events in American history, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us dig up the graves of the past to find the truth buried with the bones. Tell me in the comments, if Burr had succeeded, if he had built his empire in the West, what would North America look like today? Thank you for watching the story of the American Napoleon. The case is closed.